Welcome to High Growth Matters, a podcast that explores topics on the minds of forward-thinking HR leaders and people managers, from leadership and strategy to emerging technologies. High Growth Matters is sponsored by OpenComp, makers of the world's first compensation software that gives you clarity every time you make a decision about pay. And it's hosted by me, Caitlin Allen, a startup executive with 3 exits under my belt, along with my co-host, Nancy Connery. Nancy was founding VP of HR and employee number 5 at Salesforce, and she now leads one of the most reputable HR advisory firms in Silicon Valley. She's also co-founder of OpenComp. Don't forget to give the show a 5-star rating as we dive in. So Meera D'Souza spent 17 years at McKesson after relocating to the US from India. And while at McKesson, she was promoted across many different departments, ranging from software implementation and product training to customer education and leadership development. Meera then managed an offshore team at a call center before joining a fast-growing SaaS startup in the Midwest as an HR business partner, which was acquired in 2021, and she's currently the VP of People at fleet operations platform Fleetio. All of that is important because in this episode, we talk to Meera about what it is like to design HR with a business lens, the one that she's gained over time in her many roles, and what it means to develop a truly equitable candidate and employee experience that bridges cultural gaps. And we finally, as a bonus, cover tips for companies that are going through M&A. Meera, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Caitlin. I'm excited to be here.
We're really, really pumped to have you. So let's start off with the same question we ask all of our guests to get to know them a little personally. Meera, what is something that most of your coworkers don't know about you?
Okay, and so let's see. I work remotely. I think I shared with you earlier. And that 60% of Fleetio does the same. So I think there's probably a lot of things people don't know about, what happens after 5 or what happens after 6, like what kinds of things am I interested in? Maybe something that they don't know is that I love vintage supplies and mechanical things. So I don't know how to type, but I have 4 typewriters. I never learned how to sew, but I have 3 sewing machines that are repurposed into coffee tables and table lamps. And so I love to collect. I love to meet the collectors and the pickers and just, strike up those conversations. I know here they know I like to wordle, and I have a great streak going. But I also Candy Crush, and I'm pretty proud of that because I'm at level like 53, 52 or something like that without a single in-app purchase. So I like to have a little bit of like fun, or sometimes, like I say, doom scrolling on the phone.
No offense to our other guests, but I think that was like the best data dump of what your coworkers don't know. You get an A+. That's great information. Thank you for sharing. And so you began working in India and then restarted your career when you relocated to the US, spending, as Caitlin mentioned, an impressive 17-year tenure at McKesson with a number of promotions along the way. So congratulations. That is not easy to achieve. What was that experience like for you? And what did you learn about the importance of neutralizing culture gaps?
Yeah, it was a while back. So I have to go back to like almost 27 years ago was when I first made that transition, right? And so it definitely feels a lot easier today when you look back in hindsight. But I think the transition was actually more difficult than I had imagined it to be, because I was coming from a country that I was familiar with, where I had grown up. I understood the employment marketplace. I understood how to interview, how to get a job. And then I come to a country that seemingly has a lot in common, right? The same language. The dress is not, something that I'm unfamiliar with. We did listen to music from the US. We could claim that we were watching Hollywood movies. soap operas, and that was like the view into what life in the US was, right? But it was still unfamiliar for me in terms of like, how do you navigate the workplace? Where do you even start to look for a job, given that this was pre-social media, pre-LinkedIn? Where are jobs advertised? And some well-meaning advice, just in terms of like, you do better if you just move to computer science, if you were an engineer. People are used to seeing more engineers, more programmers coming from outside the US. And for a hot minute, I did consider that, but then I decided to stay with HR and see what would come out of it, right? So, as luck would have it, for whatever reason, we had a home computer, we had a dial-up connection through the library, and our local newspaper was just about beginning to digitize a few job ads. And so through that is where I found the opportunity at McKesson and applied for it. And that was the first step that I took to kind of restart my career. Now, I would say that, again, without social media, without that pressure, it was a couple steps back, maybe even more than a couple steps back in terms of the level of job that I was starting at. And I'm sure if I had talked to like 5 or 6 colleagues or friends, they'd be like, don't do it. It's not good for your career. But it's what I needed, right? Because I had to understand what are the rules of engagement, what are the legalities, how are benefits done in the US compared to in India. So it was for me, even though a few steps back, a good starting place. So I'd say that, the transition in that case for me was a little bit more stark maybe than it would be for most people, because it was an international relocation, right? But I'm sure every one of your listeners is experiencing some type of transition, right? Whether you transition from one company to the other, you transition from one job to the other, one level to another, you become a director or a VP, you begin to work with new generations in the workforce. Every one of these brings a cultural nuance. So, maybe geographical relocation makes it a much more stark contrast, but any migration, any movement can create that same cultural kind of dissonance. Like you're used to one thing, you came from something familiar, and you have to learn the norms and the values of something else, right? So from that perspective, I like to use the analogy of the iceberg, right? Where above the waterline, you see the things that are more obvious, right? The things that are well stated. Like for me, coming to the US, I knew the language was common. I knew about dress, I knew music, I knew movies, like I said, soap operas. This was above the waterline, but life is really below the waterline, right? Like, how do you get a job? How do people make decisions in the workplace? How do you advance in your career? How are things communicated? A very direct versus what a direct communication style, I think, in the US compared to more of the indirect communication style that I was used to. So really, understanding that what's under the waterline below what you can see is what you really have to decode. And the best way for me to decode that was just to keep a healthy curiosity. Like, know that this could be different. Maybe I should ask a few more questions. I'm also big into like just observation. Like I love to sit and watch and see how things are happening. So that was very helpful to me as I would see what was successful for some people or how different people approach different situations. And of course, just having a good sense of humor, because, invariably, you will say something that is really different and everyone's just staring at you because it's not a word that they might be used to hearing. I think when you begin to look at it as, there's things that and that are well stated, and then there are things that you have to get to know. And to get to know that, there's a lot of give and take, and it really is about giving before you take, right? Like you have to share why you think differently or what you were thinking about a particular situation before people realize and say, oh, all right, if that's the case, then we approach it slightly differently here. So to me, that was a big part of like navigating and exposing the parts of the cultural nuances that are much more difficult to discern if you were just looking at it from the outside. So one example I'd like to give is just, communication patterns in the US are more direct. And there's a great use of active voice, a lot of I statements, and a lot of results and accomplishments that go with the I statement. Coming from a culture which was more collective, we didn't use a lot of I. We used more we. Rarely do you talk about results and accomplishments. You talk more about process and collaboration. So very different approach, right? So it's just a simple question like, someone assigns me a project and they say, hey, Meera, can you do this? And my answer was usually, I think, very indirect. It took me years to figure this out. But it was always like, yeah, it can be done. And the minute I would say that, I'd get peppered with questions, right? Can be done by who? Well, me. Are you going to be able to make the date? Do you need help? Why is it so vague, right? And then it took me a really long time. And through the power of observation, seeing a particular coworker not have to go through this, it's like, what does he do that I don't do? And the simple answer was, if he got asked that question, he simply said, I got it. I got it. And that just changed my perspective. So it was that curiosity. It was that, just digging my heels in to figure things out. So I think I would say that using that analogy, wherever you go, right, irrespective of what that move is, really understanding what's below the waterline and decoding it will really help you to kind of bridge those cultural gaps or the dissonance that you might feel from moving to something less familiar.
Great. Wonderful advice and intel.
Such good examples too, Meera. What's coming to mind for me, because I'm currently taking Spanish lessons on my phone. I used to be fluent in college. My daughters live in Mexico. My stepdaughters live in Mexico. And I was with them last weekend, and there were about a half a dozen examples over the course of the weekend where I said something my app had told me to say, and they explained to me why that didn't happen in Mexico. And it's a small example of what you're talking about, but I'm so understanding. So thank you for giving us the practical.
Absolutely. And even things like, just sometimes it would degenerate into laughter because I would use the word fortnight to indicate like this will happen every 15 days. And, I would get corrected to, that's biweekly. And then I'd be like, no, biweekly is twice a week. They're like, no, then what do you think bi-monthly is? And it's like, that's twice a month. No, that's every 2 months. And it would just degenerate into like, we're saying the same words, but they mean different things depending on where your English was anchored, right? British English versus American English.
So true. So next question, you came to the US on a dependent visa, which at the time was not a problematic category, but today the H-1B green card process, can last a lifetime, and it can prevent a large pool of talent from working simply because they lack the employment authorization. So I'm curious how that experience of yours shaped your approach to crafting a recruiting experience that perhaps is more equitable and diverse than the norm.
Sure. You're right? When I came in, it was a much shorter process, but it didn't feel like it. So even though I received my work authorization within 8 weeks and, our green card came through in 6 months, the rest of the cultural assimilation, driving, for example, to get to a job, these activities took longer. And what it did for me in that 1 year was, I kind of oscillated between feeling hopeful that at the end of that, I would find something, but also sometimes feeling very hopeless, like losing my confidence because it was taking longer than I would have imagined to get back on my feet and be financially independent again. So seeing how difficult the program is today, I recognize that it must be 10 times as stressful for trailing spouses when they're coming to the country, relocating and seeking to kind of get their balance. And what does that do to their confidence and their sense of hopelessness, right? But it also prompts me to think of what other groups might be impacted because they just don't have the access to the right information or the resources, or they face barriers to entering the workforce. So a good example could be, first time college grads. No one in their family has graduated from college. They now have no mentors to be able to guide them to get into the workforce. How should they interview? How should they do their salary negotiation? There are no role models for them. Like, how did they start? How did they find their feet? Or women in general, right? Looking at, and this was an interesting thing that my colleagues at Flex had done, which is like looked up all this research that said that women don't tend to apply to jobs unless they feel like they meet 100% of the requirements. And so, really trying to identify not just one group, but what groups get marginalized for what reasons. And then how can you construct employer or other support mechanisms to help them through that journey, I think was one of the important things that I took away from my experience. So for example, with the trailing spouses, right? Just educating employers about what that immigration status means. It's actually a very fast way to get someone to work for you because you don't have to do the immigration process for a trailing spouse that has the work authorization. And they're very talented, they're available to work immediately. Most of the time they have longer tenures with you. So that part of the education for an employer becomes important. But I also try to kind of pay back into the immigrant community through volunteer work that I do. So there's a young lady who has a small business called the Immigrant Academy, and she offers like these boot camps on workforce readiness for people that have their work authorization. So I'll conduct a simple session for them on interviewing. And I would share the material with you and it'd be like, there's nothing new here. I know this all. But it's amazing how new it feels to every one of them because the rules of interviewing are different in each country. So that's one thing that, has really helped me kind of give back more from an individual's perspective, educate from the employer perspective. But I'd love to share the example of what we did successfully, or my colleagues did successfully at Plex, which is in casting a wider net for people who want to only apply for a job when they meet 100% of the requirements. So we took these jobs and we separated out the need to have versus the nice to have. And as easy as that sounds, we all like to write the job description that makes it feel like your dream job. But it's not the dream for everyone when you include everything in the job description. It actually becomes a barrier after a point for some people. And so really separating out the need to have, making it focused on what you absolutely must bring as table stakes, and then using the nice to have questions more in the interview process. Like that, I think, and again, we can only say anecdotally, but we immediately felt a lift in the number of women who were applying or other groups that were underrepresented because of the way we tailored the job description. So I just try to keep those learnings in mind, put myself in those shoes and think about like what would be helpful. And so these were just a couple examples that I thought I could share with you.
That reminds me, being sensitive to kind of the whole partner equation when you're dealing with visas, and just remembering that there's oftentimes families involved, and so it was very important to us back in the Salesforce days when we did a lot of visa work, was to make sure that communication was so crisp, so clear before they asked the questions. And so I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I also love the way that you give back too. So great work there. And, so you led talent development at a company in the Midwest, and it was eventually acquired by Rockwell back in 2021. And, a significant cohort of our listeners live and work in the Midwest. And, it is, for all intents and purposes, a little bit of a different startup scene, if you will, than kind of being in the hub of it here in the Bay Area where I'm actually located. What nuances a company being a part of a SaaS company in that part of the country?
Yeah, and I didn't work on either coast, so this is all I've seen, right? And I think what is amazing is for three companies now, so including the original company that I joined with at McKesson, it was a tech startup in the 1970s doing online billing for healthcare providers. And I'm thinking, wow, that was pretty revolutionary for its time,
Yeah.
because it's so different, right? And likewise at Plex, Fleetio, et cetera, like great ideas are not bound by geography. They are everywhere. And so I think that's valuable to know that there are a lot of successful entrepreneurs in the Midwest, in the heartland. And that, when what they're interested to do is to scale those ideas, right? Monetize those ideas to basically solve in a very unique way what the customer pain point is, create gainful employment for their workforce, and make money at it, right? Grab the market share, make money at it. I don't think that is different, irrespective of where you're located. But then about 5 years ago, I heard a frustrated leader just express, well, I keep getting this Midwest nice. And it's like, what's Midwest nice? Like, I've only been in the Midwest. Like, what are they talking about? And it can't be something that is very specific to, it must be a matter of perspective, right? And so I kept digging to see, like, what does he see as the difference? What would he like to see instead? And like I said, the business reason to start up a company or a tech company, a SaaS company, remains the same irrespective of your geography. But when you look at the culture spectrum, and if you have relationship first versus task first as the spectrum, I think it matters or is a little bit different on what is your starting point to get to that business objective. So maybe in the Midwest, we like to start with the relationship first, where we want to know, like, before we work together, let's get to know each other a little bit. Let's get to know your background. Let's share with you where we've been, what we've done, the typical, like, we've tried this before and we've tried that before. It's almost like a showcase of each other's capabilities, getting to know each other. And when we feel secure in that relationship, then, it's like gangbusters to get to the business goal. Whereas if you're coming more from a task first, right? In a task first, it's like, let's work together, let's figure out what everyone brings to the table, their domain expertise. And then when we have a successful outcome, it would be nice to go out and grab a few beers or have dinner, and then we can accelerate the business outcomes even more. And so the difference sometimes is that you feel like when you're going relationship first, that you're not hearing those terms that usually are the language around urgency, around risk-taking, around intensity. And for someone that's, task first, they're like, I just keep hearing things like, oh, we'll figure it out. Let's take our time to get there. The customer is always the most important. And really, these are not different ideas. They're just different starting points. So as an HR practitioner, if you're entering a workforce where you're hearing that there is that dissonance between language that is spoken by different people, whether it's leaders, employees, newer people that have entered that company, it's like, maybe look for, is it just the approach that is different? Because literally every company still does exist for the same reason, is to solve the customer's pain points and do it well with a very inspired workforce. So to me, that was one of the things that kind of stands out based on my experience and just trying to understand what Midwest Nice was.
Mm-hmm. It's a real thing.
That's what I hear.
Yeah. Communication. It really is. I could even see that the styles that you're talking about potentially being things that come into play just between different teams too, different departments.
That's correct. So that's where it's like, taking the time to, I think, understand those different starting points is really helpful.
Yeah, it's so central to communicating. So you've been on the acquirer's side at McKesson several times, and then on the other side of the M&A fence during the Rockwell acquisition. How can companies bring people into the fold and make them feel whole during M&A, which is a big question. So that's not something that is often the case during such a company event.
It can be challenging to navigate. So again, it's another transition, right? You were a standalone company, now you're part of something bigger. And in every case, I thought that there was always excitement when that event took place. Because for the acquiring company, it's like we get to offer our customers great technology, a proven solution, something that is so different that we could not have done it on our own. So there's a lot of excitement around that. And for the acquired company, it's like, wow, you saw the value in us. We can be the flagship product for your strategy. We can go even further now with your resources and what you bring to the table. And so that initial excitement is very strong. And I think soon after that, again, we talk about what's going on below the waterline, right? People just want to know, what does this mean for me, right? What does it mean for my role? Are you going to find me to be redundant? What's the org design going to look like? Will we still have all the agility, flexibility that we had come to appreciate? And then, more fundamentally, what about my salary? What about my benefits? What are you going to take away from me? These become real concerns, and they can become all-consuming if we don't take the time to kind of address in what order should we address it and what makes the most sense. So really planning, I think, for that, so that you don't lose the excitement of the business event, but you also take care of the individual during that time. So one of the things that we did at Rockwell is we had a great partnership with the HR team, so the two HR teams together, really working closely to identify those things that were either common or better, and immediately kind of explain that, bring that to the employee base so that they understand that, oh, this is something that's going to be continuing into the future. And then also having a list of things that were perceived to maybe be worse, because without due diligence, you actually don't know if it's worse, right? So a good example of that was our vacation policy. We were coming from responsible time off, which sometimes is just unlimited time off, right, is how it's interpreted. Or there was a more tenure-based time off, at Rockwell. If you just compared that one aspect, one fruit to the other, the apple to the apple, it would have felt that we were worse off. But when you take the entire fruit basket and you look at, well, what other leaves can we avail of under Rockwell, it was a much richer program. And so really taking each of those things people have concerns with, doing your due diligence, understanding whether there's adversity that is upcoming on any of those factors, seeing how best you can mitigate that adversity, and then communicating that early to people so that they have time to kind of get used to the new normal, or they can relax that things will be fine for them. And I think we had a phenomenal partnership there with the Rockwell HR team, where we were able to present that to employees, several months in advance of the changes, and really help them get into the headspace of all right, I'm going to be fine. Let's get excited about the business here.
Communication is key in those situations, 100%. Let's talk, about designing HR with a business lens for a minute, if we can, which is something that, you gained from working in customer and software education, then leadership development, then software implementation, kind of summarizing everything from your end, then managing offshore teams at a call center. How have you approached this process at Fleetio in your role as VP of People?
Yeah, and I think for me, it was like not having tunnel vision, right? I'd been in HR for so long that it becomes almost like, what can be the next program that I design that's going to be so great and that, has a theme and graphics and all the good stuff, right? And when I took the role in the business, leading the implementation team and the technical services team, I actually got to taste some of my own medicine. And all of a sudden, it's like, okay, that program was great, But when you are also trying to manage a P&L and you are trying to handle customer escalations and keep the customer satisfaction high and resolve problems on the go. We were implementing in pharmacies that were attached to large hospitals. There is no time to make a mistake, right? You're running a very intense business. In the middle of that, if you have to stop to send a person to a 3-day training program, you have to take 1 week off to do your annual performance reviews or participate in calibration or do compensation planning. It just felt like, okay, if I get a chance to do this again, I would love to bring my business experience and become more practical in the types of programs that I design or that I'm able to really help the company move forward with. So here at Fleetio, and Plex too, I really appreciated the HRBP role. And we've started to build out that practice here with really emphasizing that the B is for business, right? Embedding ourselves in the business, understanding the overall business context, participating in business meetings, supporting leaders, in the discussions that they need to have with employees, being available to our employees during interactions that are key to continue to anchor to the business. That's what we are striving for. And we've started to build out that business partner practice here. A simple thing that I'm doing right now as we're building that practice is after our executive team meeting ends on a Tuesday, we meet as a people leadership team right away so that it's like, hey, these were some of the concerns that came up from a business perspective, may have some people repercussions. Look out for these issues or dive deeper during the week to find out if there are any concerns, if anyone needs our support, what do they need to move the business forward? So that's something simple that, I've been able to do while we continue to figure out ratios and what's the support that's truly needed. And then the other thing would be just aligning your programs, to be practical, as well as to match the business planning, right? So if you have a annual performance review process, but you do quarterly business planning through OKRs, right there's a little bit of friction because the two things don't give the individual the alignment towards what the company is trying to achieve. So can we create, performance review process that flows out of our OKR planning? Can we create feedback in real time so that you have every week during which you might be able to adjust or tweak, or maybe a month or a quarter during which you can take on significant projects? So that's another part of what we are trying to bring. And I think both of those, were informed by my time in the business and realizing that if I get one more chance, I would love to be a different HR person.
Great learning.
Thank you for that. Yeah. What's one common belief in the HR and people practice that you disagree with?
I don't disagree with, but I always flinch just a little bit if we join a meeting as an HR person or from a people team, people are just wondering, why are you here? You're going to do scary things, right? And I would love for everyone to see how, if we truly partner with the business and we are practical in our approach of how we do things, we can actually move the business and individuals forward. So I'd love for a time when I join a meeting and I don't have at least two people. It's like, why is HR on the call?
There's definite truth in that perception. And whatever we can do to change that perception, I think will go a very, very long way for sure. And I have a meeting coming up soon where that very topic came, for front and center. And this has been such a great conversation with you today, Meera. And, we always kind of end on a very high note with our listeners and ask our guests to say, what's the top thing we can all take away from today's conversation with you?
Yeah, I really do hope, because you covered such a nice mix of topics. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm hoping that everyone picks up a little something to help them in their HR practice. I think for my own self, I would say that my learning was, right, that keep your curiosity alive as an individual, as a business leader, because there's always so much to learn. Never mind how long you have spent in the industry or in your profession, and really make it your mission to uncover as much of the iceberg below the waterline as you can. Because by making those things more visible, more accessible to everyone, you can start really making a difference to be more equitable and have more of that outreach to groups that traditionally may not have the resources. I'd say a good sense of humor will never fail you. But if all else fails, Candy Crush, because it will give you a little bit of just stress relief and make you feel like I got this. If I can pass this level, I think I can solve the next problem as well.
What a wonderful way to end. So thank you for that, Meera. Before we say goodbye to our guests, please give us a 5-star rating, and you can email me at podcast@opencomp.com if you have ideas for topics or guests that Nancy and I can speak to. And just saying another thank you, Meera. This has been wide-reaching and really, really educational and fun to chat with you.
And thank you to you both. Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Caitlin. I really enjoyed this time together.
Thank you. Likewise.
Win top talent while strengthening runway with OpenComp. Thousands of the world's fastest growing companies use our compensation intelligence platform because it offers the most competitive benchmarks and insights available. To learn more, visit app.opencomp.com/signup.